I think it's absolutely stunning to hear former President Barack Obama, who should know better, to say that Islam ought to be able to practice religion as it sees fit in the West, knowing that Islam allows a man to beat a woman to bring her into submission. It just seems so counterintuitive with respect to everything else he supposedly stands for. But it's not just him. I mean, you think of Carly Fiorina talking about the myth of the Andalusian paradise. I mean, she personified it. I mean, if it wasn't for Islam, we'd be still living in the Dark Ages. It was Islam that brought mathematics and philosophy and the culture of the Greeks through the Christian Dark Ages into the present light. You can go through these intellectual they're cultural elites, but they're very intellectual people as well. I mean, Barack Obama grew up in a Muslim context. He knows all this stuff. He's a historian. And yet, given the fact that he seems to be for women's rights, he's willing to go back and say that this barbaric religion ought to be practiced as modern Muslims see fit in Western democracies. It didn't make any sense.
Well, it makes sense to me in a very kind of weird way that, you may or may not agree with. And it kind of goes, I think I've alluded to this, it's basically the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I really believe that the grand enemy that is behind this sort of thinking, the grand enemy for this sort of thinking is historic, traditional, cultural, Christian ethics, which have built Western civilization. So this is why someone like Obama and your average feminist white woman in America will say what you just said about how wonderful Islam is, even though they can see with their own eyes the opposite of their own claims and read with their own eyes in the Quran and the Hadith and so forth, the opposite of their own claims, and yet lambast, Christian patriarchy constantly, which doesn't do anything like that, and in fact is behind the so-called liberation of women. Because fundamentally, I really don't think any of these people give a fig about human rights or about female rights or about anything. I think they are ultimately motivated by a desire to demonize and thereby justify breaking away from historic Christianity. You ever think to yourself, when you think of civilizations around the world, it's only the West is distinct for having such an abhorrent hatred for its own past. No one else has this break in continuity. Muslims, of course, as we know, praise and glorify their history, but so do Hindus, so do the Chinese and the Japanese. Everyone does. What is behind the fact that the one civilization that actually had a meteoric rise in the world and that abolished slavery and that did all and create, brought all these boons, technology and democracy and freedom. And now it is so hated by its own people and demonized as being the absolute worst civilization ever. Now, to me, you can't explain that rationally. There's something else behind it. There's a darker force behind this sort of thinking because it is so singular, it is so irrational, it is so topsy-turvy. And like I said, I believe it begins and it ends with, you look at what we call liberals, multiculturalists, secularists, feminists, atheists, homosexuals, whatever you want to call them. Muslims, of course, who aren't even part of that. They all have the same common disdain for Christian cultural ethics and mores deep down inside, whether they say it or not. And that is I believe that is the driving force for what they do and what they say. It's not because they care about other people. It's not because of their humanitarian inclinations or their need to see women liberated or so forth. No, that's always the pretext that's being used for the other reason.